Friends, very good to have you join us again. James, very nice to see you.
Yeah, thank you. Nice to see you too, Ian, and great to have everybody with us.
And we managed to avoid any comment about seeing people. Very good. James, who are you and where are you?
I'm the vicar of Histon and Impington. So that's two villages just over the sort of border from Cambridge, about 3 miles out of the centre of Cambridge.
Right. Impington sounds slightly naughty.
It does. And actually it was the home of Samuel Pepys's uncle.
Right.
And
okay.
Samuel Pepys once went to the church there and said that he heard a good plain sermon when he was staying with his uncle, and also that the locals treated him with respect and due deference. But we don't have any of that sort of nonsense anymore.
Of course, in those days, a good plain sermon, that was clearly a virtue.
Yeah, indeed. Absolutely. Yeah.
Unnecessary ornaments. Great.
Good, solid doctrine.
Yeah, good. Excellent. Well, I'm glad, and I'm sure you're keeping it in that tradition as well.
Absolutely.
Well, friends, I'm Ian Paul, which you may know, might be from the blog or from looking at the YouTube channel. And I'm nowhere near Cambridge at all. I'm in Nottingham, just in the suburb in Chilwell, on the west side on the way to Derby. James, where have we got to in the lectionary?
Yeah, well, we're on Matthew 10, 24 to 39, which is the reading for the third Sunday after Trinity.
The third Sunday after Trinity, right? Yes, that's right. Yeah,
that is the precise title of the Sunday.
Thank you. Well done. I was about to catch you out and say, you didn't tell me where we were in the lectionary, but you then immediately did. So
yeah,
well done. That's great.
Yeah.
We're on form today.
I appear to be, but whether that will last is another matter.
Now, this is a slightly unusual reading to preach on, I think, and a little bit awkward. I mean, I think one of the things I said on the blog article about, which we'll follow posting tomorrow, is that it's a kind of mix'em gatherum. I like that phrase. Yeah. It's a mix'em gatherum here of stuff, which Matthew has constructed, and there's some slightly awkward joins, really, of material, aren't there? And in fact, he's already made the transition from just at the beginning of this chapter we looked at last week, where the disciples are sent out. And then from verse 16, it all seems to change the focus a bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And it seems to be, he seems to have more general phrases, more general instruction, more general teaching from what was quite a particular sending out of the mission of the 12. So that's slightly strange. And yet here, once again, there's some quite significant changes of subject, it feels. And yet sometimes the subject of the next little bit must link somehow with the previous bit, and you're trying to work out who are they and who are them, and what's the connection. And I agree. I think it is a bit it was clearly edited together, which Matthew obviously does for part of his particular purpose in the way he wants to tell the story of Jesus.
He does, and of course this is the second of his 5 collections of Jesus's sayings. So obviously the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5, 6, and 7, and then the second collection of sayings now in chapter 10. And just worth noticing that when you get to the end of this collection of sayings, each time we know it's a collection because Matthew finishes with this characteristic phrase in 11:1, when Jesus had finished saying all these things, or when Jesus had finished instructing his disciples and so on. It's just something that's occurred to me while you were speaking there, is I wonder whether, I don't know whether this is convincing or not, but I wonder whether the connections between the material are not logical connections, but whether they're just from verbal connections. The reason I say that is that the letter from James, which is also very much in this Jewish idiom, people also puzzled about the logical progression. In fact, what you actually find in James is a connection. One particular word stimulates James to reuse that word, but it leads into a different set of material.
Yes, that's interesting, isn't it? And of course, all of this section, the second section of teaching in Matthew from Jesus is about mission. So in a sense, he's deliberately bringing together things which are about what happens when you as a disciple engage in the mission which Jesus calls you to. So that's an important thematic connection. And Jesus has been quite fulsome, really, in the challenge as well as in the previous week, the joys and of it as well.
Yeah, indeed. It's worth just commenting a little bit on the text just prior to the passage we've got, because it kind of sets a context, and we can see that he's clearly focusing on this sort of the distant future, as it were, or at least the future of the disciples' ministry.
Yeah.
And I make a comment which I think I'm pushing the boat out a little bit, but I hope it's persuasive. With the previous section ends with, when they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Now, of course, traditionally, that language has been interpreted as being a reference to Jesus's return from his heavenly home to earth at the end of time. And given that he's still talking about the disciples going through the towns of Israel, that would imply an expectation of the imminent parousia, which doesn't happen, which is disappointing. Now, I make the point that this is actually quite a difficult interpretation to justify, because it doesn't only make Jesus mistaken about the imminent parousia. It also makes Matthew, writing some 20, 30 years later, also mistaken, which seems entirely implausible. And in fact, it seems to me it's much better to read this as understanding that phrase about the coming of the Son of Man, as it is in chapter 24, about the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds to the Ancient of Days, using the language from Daniel 7. Now, I don't want to twist your arm, but I was just wondering how convincing you found my challenge to the common reading.
I do find it convincing, actually. I think one of the reasons I find it convincing is that Jesus in his ministry in the Gospels very clearly takes Daniel as a key Old Testament passage for understanding himself and what was going on. So if Jesus, and Matthew records it, uses that phrase, then it seems highly likely that it means what Daniel means by it. And to twist it to mean the parousia would be a very odd thing to do. And I think actually the New Testament is pretty consistent about this in terms of, when the Son of Man comes, it means ascension. It doesn't mean parousia, so that's quite important.
Unless it's using that term.
Unless it's using that term in the phrase, exactly.
And we're rather hamstrung by the fact that so many, even contemporary translations, still use the phrase "the coming of the Son of Man" to translate both that verbal phrase from Daniel, but also the noun phrase, the parousia of the Son of Man.
So that they kind of coalesce into, and there's just massive uncertainty. So I agree. I do think, and I think the other thing is that, in a sense, these are Jesus teaching about mission. So it's quite important to tell the disciples that after he's gone, there's still a mission to engage in. You've still got to go through all the towns of, and of course that's more consistent with Matthew 28 and the Jesus, the Great Commission. So he's telling them there's still a job to do after the ascension.
It's very interesting that you I mean, I haven't noticed that at all in the article, but that you comment on that relationship with Matthew 28, because of course what he's then saying is up to the ascension, your mission area is Israel, but with the ascension, then the zone of mission changes. Now it is to all nations.
To all nations, but of course those all nations still include the nation of Israel, don't they? And that mission's really important.
It's not to all nations except Israel. It's to all nations, including.
It's an inclusive.
So we get into our actual text here, verse 24, and this is, as you mentioned, this suddenly seems to be quite a bizarre change of focus, a change of subject. Although actually we can see how it ties in with the things Jesus has been saying, because they are going to face opposition and difficulty. A disciple is not above his teacher, nor is a slave. Again, English translations tend to say servant, but of course we've got the word doulos, which Paul uses to describe himself. One of the things, again, I've been struck with this passage is there are lots and lots of interesting connections with Pauline language, which is a little bit surprising, because of course we generally would connect Paul, particularly his theological outlook, with the Gospel of Luke. Just having noticed there are connections there, but also if the Luke of the Gospel is Paul's companion, then you can see the links. But actually there's lots of links between Matthew's language here and Paul.
Yeah, we've spotted that several times, haven't we? I noticed that New RSV translates slave, so NIV translates servant, interestingly. So
and the ESV translates servant as well, which is
does it? That's really interesting, isn't it? Given the different words behind the text.
Well, it also has a little footnote saying or bond servant.
Okay.
But also this saying is unusual in the sense that, again, there's an echoes of sayings we find elsewhere in the Gospels, but with a kind of Matthean twist to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose the key thing here is that, it's pointing to the fact that if you're going to be like your rabbi, if you're going to be like the master, like the teacher, that includes everything, actually. There's nothing that's excluded from that. And therefore, that's why if the head of the house has been called Beelzebul, how much more the members of his household?
Yes.
And that's something that, I mean, I know in my own teaching, I emphasize this over and over again. Actually, the whole point of the Christian life is to be like Jesus. It's to imitate Jesus, isn't it? And it's that this text just and indeed the bit that follows completely, I think, support that.
It does. The fact that he talks about the disciples as his servants is an interesting phrase as well, because typically they'd be Jesus would refer to them as the servants of God.
Yeah.
And in fact, Dick France picks this up in his commentary and says it's a striking turn of phrase which speaks strongly of Matthew's sense of the unique authority of Jesus in relation to those who've been called to follow him. But of course, we see that all over the Gospels, don't we?
Yeah. Very high Christology, absolutely. And this idea that they're being challenged to become one with Jesus in his sufferings as well as in all the rest of it is it's a vital lesson, isn't it? Because that is what the early Christians experienced, and those. Matthew recalls the gospel that there's got to be some kind of explanation.
And again, a really clear connection with Paul's own language, which when we come across it in Philippians 3, we do find quite shocking, where he says, to somehow become like in his sufferings.
Yeah, absolutely. And his words in Colossians about fulfilling my own body the sufferings of Christ and all that.
I have, as it happens on social media today, I actually read someone post a quotation from John Stott, where he notes two things. One is that the consistent teaching of Scripture, but also the lesson of our experience is the purposes of our suffering is to grow in maturity and to grow in holiness.
Right.
And he also offers a really striking reflection on experience. He says that when you meet someone who has suffered, there's something different about them. He says there's kind of an aroma of Christ about them, which just isn't there otherwise. So I mean, it's a very difficult concept to handle, because we don't want to go around actually sort of seeking out suffering, but in the end, actually, God does something in us and with us through difficulties, which actually doesn't happen without that experience of difficulty and suffering.
Yeah, and of course that's exactly what Romans 5, Paul in Romans 5 says, doesn't he, about the whole sort of journey into endurance and perseverance. I mean, interestingly, in my last parish, I had somebody who once said to me, after their 17-year-old son had just failed his driving test, said, I'm so glad he failed his driving test. I said, why is that? I said, because he passes everything else, all that, and he actually needs to experience that failure. In a sense, actually, you can see that that's important for our lives, isn't it? So even at sort of quite a basic level. But spiritual level, wow,
yeah. But it's difficult because you want your kids to avoid the difficult things.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, exactly. It's not easy. Not an easy one, that.
Yeah. Now we come into the next section, verse 26, and again, there's quite a distinct change of language and focus. But it does seem. I mean, maybe my theory about the connection. Linking sort of words and then moving on to a different idea, maybe that does work, because it's interesting that Matthew seems to then, or Jesus' teaching here that Matthew has brought together, seems to explain why we should have no fear of them, which is presumably the antecedent is those who malign the disciples, who also persecuted Jesus, who have called him the son of Beelzebul. But the focus becomes quite different. Have no fear of them, for nothing is covered that will not be revealed, nor hidden that will not be known. Now, I've got in my mind, there was a poem in the film of Sense and Sensibility, which, oh God, this is me being spontaneous when I know it's a bad idea, where the captain who ends up winning over Kate Winslet, he reads her a poem, and actually the poem includes a phrase just like this.
Right.
Sorry, that was a complete aside, which doesn't really add anything, so I should have looked that up.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because you as soon as you read it, you think, "Whoa, wait a minute! What's been concealed? What is it that's going to be disclosed? What's going to be hidden?" And if you know anything about the way Jesus speaks to his disciples, clearly he he teaches them in secret, doesn't he?
Yes.
So I mean, that's one potential sort of avenue. The whole messianic secret thing, the concealing of Jesus' identity until in order to avoid an early death, presumably, is also in the frame there, I think, isn't it?
But in bringing these two bits of Jesus' teaching together, I mean, Matthew seems to be slightly confusing two different issues, because on the one hand, it's just saying, look, if people are mean to you, if they do malign you, then actually this is going to be broadcast. But there's going to be accountability. There is going to be judgment. It's going to be made plain, and the implication is you will be vindicated. And then he's linked another saying to do with darkness and light, which is, and again, it seems to be a particular take on the parallel phrase in Luke. I think it's in Luke 12.
Luke 12,
says, nothing, and there's a parallel in Mark 4 as well. Nothing is covered up, will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. And he says, well, never mind about the fact that these things will be known. I want you to make them known. This teaching you've heard in secret, I want you to broadcast it. And
it's interesting, the parallels in Luke and some of these sayings actually kind of open up or pin down the metaphorical nature or the hyperbolic nature of some of these sayings. It's quite interesting, because Luke says, what you have whispered behind closed doors.
Yes.
Which
he actually brings out the
and he does that several times in this passage in the parallels.
There's just a little note in terms of the cultural context, because again, a lot of translations say housetops or rooftops. But of course, in the context where Jesus is talking to his disciples, primarily the rooftops would have been flat, so they put beams, and you'd put sort of thatch material and mud on top, so that in Mark 2, when they're lowering the man, they can dig a hole in the flat roof. And in fact, the word is domaton. So from the word doma, from which ultimately I think we get the word domestic. So, and of course, if you're on the hillside and you've got this sort of stacking up of these flat roofed houses, then
you cover a lot.
Well, standing on the top is where you'd be able to broadcast it from.
You really would.
And amazing how we forget, because we're used to amplification in the ancient world. I mean, just you can call out and a voice can be heard from a very long way away.
And there's not ambient noise around other than not so much at all. No, extraordinary, isn't it?
We were once in a very well preserved theatre, and one of the people we were with was a singer, so she stood in the middle of the theatre circle. We went right to the seating at the very top of this Roman theatre. And she sang her heart out, and we could hear every single word and every single syllable.
Wow! That's amazing, isn't it?
And it was a theatre would have held 20,000 people.
Wow!
It's really quite striking.
That's extraordinary.
And then we have another change of focus, but of course the link is that word fear again. Do you know my theory about this sort of word linking? I think
you're building it up nicely. Actually.
I'm building the case here.
I think you are.
I think it's true, because again, you see, now he's picking up the word fear, and then another phrase we get again, which we have the parallels in the other Gospels. Do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Although, of course, here the word psyche for soul doesn't mean a kind of platonic idea that we have a soul in no material body, but it means the whole person, the life.
And I think one of the things one of the questions of course is immediately asks is, who is the one who can kill the body and the soul? I notice in the NIV it puts one with a capital O.
Okay.
Which is interesting. It's trying to tell you that this is God alone, as it were, who has this power of life and death.
It is.
Whereas it's quite easy, I think, in the context, having just heard about Beelzebul, it's quite easy to read this passage and think, is that the evil one? What is going on? So I think that clarity actually is really helpful from the NIV there. It points us in the right direction, doesn't it?
And here's the paradox, because on the one hand, Jesus is talking about it is God himself who has the power over life and death, and yet this God is our loving Father. So it's holding together fear and Father, that that God is powerful and almighty, but the one who is powerful is the one who actually cares for us. And the image of the sparrows, that takes us right back to Matthew 6, doesn't it? And teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, the hairs of your head are all numbered. I suppose, sorry, I can't help making a joke. I feel more consolation than you on that one, I suppose.
Thank you very much, Ian. Definitely need to avoid these spontaneous remarks.
I do. Sorry, that wasn't very pastoral, was it? So there we go.
Well, it's the fact that the Lord has counted them that matters, not how many I've got.
That is true. That is true.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then we get another
change.
Another change of focus. Gosh, my goodness me. Everyone who acknowledges me before men, I will also acknowledge my Father who is in heaven, and whoever denies me. And again, this is very typical Jewish argot in Jesus' teaching, where you have repetition and reversal, reversal. Very memorable, of course. And again, pointing to using the language of Father, but pointing to the one who will hold people to account and act in judgment.
And once again, it pushes us straight back into the very missional focus, doesn't it? The previous section has been a little bit more focused on the individual, from verse 28 onwards, and we're kind of back to the proclamation of the good news of Jesus, I think.
Acknowledgement. Another useful quotation from France: fear of God is balanced by trusting God as the disciples' heavenly Father, a repeated theme in Matthew. And in fact, Matthew is the gospel who uses the language of Father more than the other synoptics, and as much as the fourth gospel does. The God who can destroy in hell is also the God who cares for the smallest bird. Within his fatherly care, there is nothing to fear from human hostility. Now, the last bit of our reading, we're coming to the last sort of section here, down to verse 40. Does our reading go on to actual verse 40 itself?
It goes to 39, actually. 40 to 42 is next week's.
It is. That is
the three verse gospel.
Yes, my goodness me. And again, this is another change of focus. Some slightly puzzling things put together. A significant challenge, I think, to our thinking about Jesus and mission. Do not think I've come to bring peace to the earth. I've not come to bring peace, but a sword. And what is challenging about this is that the language here, he's actually drawing from Micah 7 verse 6. And Micah 7 verse 6 is actually about the chaos in Israel when people turn away from God and don't follow his commandments, his way of life. But Jesus is saying, well, this is what he's bringing. He's bringing a degree of chaos. And he sort of plugs into this, the saying about whoever does not love me more than mother and brother and sister is not worthy of me. So there's some quite challenging ideas here.
Yes, there are, and I think we need to be careful about that use of the word sword. It's not sort of peace versus war so much, but peace versus division. Because swords obviously divide things, and actually in Luke he says division rather than sword, which is interesting in the parallel.
Oh, okay. So he moves away from
another place where he kind of explains the metaphor, which is quite helpful. But it's when with the sword, of course, it becomes a starker metaphor in Matthew, doesn't it? It has a more sort of verbal impact on us. But this is so counter to culture and actually to Christian culture very often, isn't it? That and all the message of reconciliation. Actually, there are those who will follow and those who will not, and that is in itself a division, isn't it?
Now, it's interesting you mentioned culture, because it's the one thing that's really struck me about this reading is that this is an even harder saying of Jesus for his disciples than it is for us, because in first century culture, your family loyalty is the thing, and in fact, Paul reflects on that when he says, the person who neglects his own family is worse than an unbeliever. And in cultures, I'm thinking, for instance, today of cultures in the East, in the Near East and the Far East, where your duty, your ultimate duty, is to look after your family, look after your parents. And of course, we refer to this in the Christmas narratives as well, where in Luke he doesn't come to a strange place, but he's coming to his own and place of ancestry. So we know that the people would welcome him and so on. And you would, if it was your relative, you would not leave him out the street. Your primary duty is to welcome your relatives. So this is really, really startling, and it's a real challenge to a redefinition of kinship understanding. And again, I think this is a point of connection between this gospel and Paul's language, because for Paul, the primary metaphor he uses when talking about believers is brother and sister. So actually, your family relationships are now redefined by your loyalty to Jesus.
Yeah, and that absolutely, and that's, to grasp that would be transformative for the church, wouldn't it? I mean, I think where churches do that, where everybody genuinely is a brother or a sister, it's absolutely transformative. But we so often row back from that, or we treat our own biological brothers and sisters in a different way from the way we treat our Christian brothers and sisters. And actually, that's really what Jesus is, and Paul particularly are warning us against here.
And there's an interesting missional dimension to this as well, because I think those who, for example, working in Muslim majority areas will say very clearly, unless you're prepared to welcome somebody into your home as a member of your family, then you're never going to make any progress in terms of calling people to follow Jesus, because the consequence in that context would be for a Muslim, for example, to turn to Jesus, they will be cut off. They will be treated as if dead from their family. And the vision will be really stark.
Quite.
James, it's really interesting to review these verses. I don't know if you've got any thoughts about when we're faced with a passage like this and we need to preach on it. What is a helpful way in? Is it a question of finding some of those connections? Is it a question of being selective? Is it a question of picking out, for instance, the strand of mission and then looking at the different dimensions of that? Do you have any reflections on what do you do with this practically? Have you preached on this recently?
I don't think I have preached on it recently, but then I never remember these things very easily. Not in the last few months, anyway. I think what I would do is I think you've got to think of the contemporary parallels, contemporary situations, to make it relevant always. And I would be selective, actually, and I think the passage lends itself to that because of exactly what we've been saying about the disparate nature of the sayings,
the mixum gatherum.
I think and actually you've also in some way got to go with how people hear this passage. I suspect that most congregations listening to this passage would find the bit about a man against his father, a daughter against his mother, as very puzzling.
Yes.
And when I have preached on it, I've certainly addressed that issue and tried to explain what is it really that Jesus is saying here, and because otherwise it's like an elephant in the room that everybody, because still in our even in our diminished family culture, this is still a massive taboo to isn't it? I think.
Yeah. James, that's really helpful. Thanks very much. Now, before we finish, we should remind people of the 4 liturgical actions that they can very helpfully do. Yes. Which is, first of all, say if you click on like for the video, that's a really useful help, isn't it?
It is, and then do subscribe to the channel. That would be really helpful.
And there's a button there at the bottom. You can subscribe. And you can also click on the share button, which gives you a link that you can then copy and you can paste and share on social media.
And if you'd like to comment or on it, then please do that. We'd love to have your comments. It's always really good. I noticed somebody did comment last week after we couldn't remember a verse.
They did. They gave us the reference.
So they gave us the reference, which was very kind of them. Whoever you were, thank you very much indeed.
That's great. James, thank you very much. Friends, great to see you and look forward to seeing you next time.